European countries are jealous of one thing. And if we look at this graph by the Financial Times, it's not hard to understand what. The American tech industry. And it boils down to an obsession with one place, Silicon Valley. It's where, in the eyes of many Europeans, innovation, technology, and trillion-dollar companies magically pop out of. Countries across the world have been looking to replicate what is, according to one book, the greatest creation of wealth in the history of the planet. And if we look at some headlines in the news, they've managed to copy the marketing. There's Silicon Sweden, Silicon Saclay, the Silicon Valley of Europe, Battery Valley, Seed Valley, and the list goes on and on. Yet there seems to be room for careful optimism. Europe's tech industry is slowly taking off. And at the forefront of this revolution are megacities and capitals. But a series of medium-sized tech and science hubs are punching far above their weight, and they might hold the key to fixing Europe's tech woes. I wanted to find out what makes Silicon Valley so special, and if Europe's wannabe valleys are not only on the road to imitate, but also replicate the real thing. So where are Europe's Silicon Valleys, and how do they match up to the real thing? This video was sponsored by Aura. You're never safe from data leaks. Just a couple of days ago, half of all French social security numbers were potentially exposed in a health insurance hack. That's a 50% chance that my data was there. A coin flip. But it's not only your data that's exposed. It opens the possibility for identity theft and fraud. And without Aura, it would actually be difficult to know what's out there and who has my information. The scariest thing is that when I entered one of my email addresses, I actually found that it was there on the dark web, where plenty of people could use it to send spam and phishing emails. There are also people who could take this email and try to get access to my accounts by brute forcing password combinations or attempting to figure out my password reset security questions. It actually explains a lot of the emails I've been getting there, and it prompted me to change my password. Aura is actually really easy to set up, so you don't have to download several different things like VPNs, antiviruses, password management, identity theft insurance, and so much more. You just get everything at one affordable price. So if you value your privacy as much as I do mine, then go check out Aura at aura.com/intoeurope to start your 2-week free trial. Now, back to the video. So before we talk about Europe, we have to find out what is the secret sauce that makes Silicon Valley so special. That's because if Silicon Valley was a country, it would be the richest in the world, with a GDP per capita of $128,000 in 2019. It accounted for almost 28% of total venture capital spending in the US, and is the home to many of the country's top firms. And after a bunch of reading and investigating, I boiled down the area's success down to 7 main things. First among the reasons is its strong universities, with Berkeley and particularly Stanford, which historically have trained many of the top-tier engineers of the area. Second was its relative geographic isolation in the early 20th century. Local talents and companies were not co-opted into existing industries. Instead, as they looked to tackle the Bay Area's isolation, they developed expertise in electrical engineering and long-distance communication, which would prove to be the key to the information revolution. On top of this came active government support in the form of the US Department of Defense and its $30 billion R&D budget during the Cold War. But the US government was more than just a research partner. It was a customer of many of these innovations, buying high-tech planes and weapons directly, which in turn fueled entire industries. The result of this was innovations such as nuclear reactors, microwaves, computers, GPS, and the semiconductors that would give its name to the area, Silicon Valley. Fourth was the rise of American venture capitalism in the 1980s. As some of the firms in the area grew into corporate giants like Hewlett-Packard, when they went public, they drew both attention and money to the area from West Coast investors. This led at first to a slow rise in venture capital, which would boom in 1979, when the US slashed capital gains taxes from 49.5% to 28%, and allowed pension funds to invest, leading to a quadrupling of VC in the 5 following years. All of it was powered by an incentive system and a competitive environment for both workers and companies. Rather than punishing workers with non-compete agreements, which California cracked down on, loyalty was guaranteed through stock options, incentivizing workers for productivity and longer hours. At the same time, talent was free to move around between companies, helping to diffuse ideas and meaning those best at executing could reap the rewards. The promise of success would help draw new talent from across the US and the world, driving highly skilled immigration to the area. But then, surprisingly enough, Silicon Valley owes its success to the large tech companies in the area. While these also engage in monopolistic practices, they also buy out a lot of smaller firms, providing exits for founders and investors, and then help diffuse their technology to the rest of the world. With these 6 first items, Silicon Valley became a complex system where all these different actors interacted with one another. The US government would pour money into companies and research projects. Universities would train engineers who would work for companies and startups and become founders. Large companies and venture capitalists would fund and buy out some of the most successful companies and innovations, providing an exit strategy for founders and helping diffuse their technology. But there is one last secret ingredient which is harder to measure: culture. So it's safe to say that some of the elements of Silicon Valley's success, like culture, can't be replicated, at least not on a time frame that makes sense for policymakers. After all, it's the result of a 300 push westward by pioneers, colonists, and gold miners who then developed groundbreaking technology. But some areas in Europe actually get pretty close for the other criteria. So I was reading a bunch of reports on Europe's tech hubs, the statistics of funding raised, and the number of startups, and I found some pretty recurring names. It should come as no surprise that some of Europe's largest cities are on the list. London, Paris, Munich, or Stockholm have money, people, and talent aplenty. But if we plot a graph of venture capital investment per capita, a few cities are truly ahead of the pack. The top 3 cities in Europe are Oxford, Cambridge, and Grenoble on a per capita basis, with Stockholm coming a distant 4th. And if we turn our success factors for Silicon Valley into a checklist, we can see that they line up pretty closely. First, these cities have strong universities. Cambridge and Oxford speak for themselves with their domination of global university rankings. But Grenoble is the 3rd largest university in the whole of France, with about 60,000 students and 3,000 researchers. These universities tend to collaborate quite extensively with industry. And if we look at where they are, all 3 cities are rather distant from traditional industrial hubs. Grenoble is an isolated mountain city, and Oxford and Cambridge are far from industrial London, Manchester, or Birmingham. It should also come as no surprise that these Silicon Valleys come in what have historically been some of Europe's strongest militaries. Aerospace contracts of Oxfordshire stem from companies integrated with the UK Ministry of Defence. Cambridge University has ties with the military industry, and Grenoble has been the home of French military industry since its inception. And these cities benefit from favourable incentive systems nationally. The UK has historically been friendly for startups, whereas France has recently sought to make itself more attractive to business and made it easier to attract funding. And while they do lack venture capital funding, this seems to be made up in part by the support of the state, with the British Business Bank's Future Fund or France's BPI making up for part of the shortfall. But here I left out the largest city, which seems to have the best balance between scale and overall success, the number 4 on our list, Stockholm, which owes some of its tech success to the speed at which it deployed IT technology in the 1990s. Now, there are other cities that perform remarkably well by some of these metrics. Eindhoven in the Netherlands or Espoo in Finland both have strong universities and corporate champions in the form of ASML or Nokia that support the local economy, but they've been less successful in attracting investment and growing new tech startups. Yet as I mentioned previously, these wannabe valleys are booming, and tech in Europe is finally taking off. If we look at the number of unicorns, Europe is slowly closing the gap with both the United States and China. But there are some challenges, namely that Europe's tech takeoff is still dependent on the US for venture funding and on buying company exits. But not to worry, there are a couple of not-so-simple steps that Europe could take to improve its Silicon Valleys, and maybe even start new ones, and most have to do with improving the fundamentals that have been the backbone of Silicon Valley's success. The first step should be to get European militaries back in shape and make them buy European equipment. Despite recent increases, European military budgets are notoriously low, and whatever does get spent mostly ends up being used to buy American equipment. This money ends up in contractors' pockets, but also helps subsidize American defense firms and ends up pioneering research and innovation across the Atlantic. This isn't only about European sovereignty, it's also an industrial policy with money trickling down into industry and research, with about 58 billion euros being spent on defense equipment by EU countries alone in 2022. Government contracts would allow European firms long-term customers from which to grow their businesses. Granted, creating a European-wide military-industrial complex is much more complicated than in the US, with fragmented military budgets, competition between different national suppliers on pan-European projects, and a lack of political will to invest in defense. But it may be one of the surest ways to boast Europe's Silicon Valleys. The next biggest challenge is that many of Europe's most promising tech companies end up getting bought up by American industrial groups. In this case, Europe is faced with a chicken and egg problem. It needs European tech giants to buy European tech startups, but only has few tech giants to do so. And unfortunately, this is only a problem that can be resolved over time, as Europe's first and largest tech companies mature and take on bigger roles in the overall tech ecosystem. And the last point is about making sure there is more money available in Europe to invest in these companies, so as not to depend on foreign funding, particularly for bigger funding rounds, as is currently the case. And for this, there are a couple of more or less straightforward tools that have been experimented by European countries. The first of which are government investment banks, which allow companies to extend their runway to later funding rounds without the need for private money. This has actually had quite some success in France and the UK. And second is the creation of private pension funds, which create a pool of money with which to invest in tech companies. These huge pension funds in the US are the backbone of the venture capital firms that end up investing in tech startups. And finally, the European Union can make it easier to invest capital across borders by developing a capital markets union. But there is little appetite for that, as cross-border investment is still rather limited across the EU. But more importantly still is the belief that Europe can manage to do these things on its own. But what do you think? Will Europe's Silicon Valleys become as successful as the real deal, or are they destined to remain pale imitations of the OG? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. This was Into Europe. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you'd like to learn more about the economic challenges facing Europe, then I invite you to watch this video on Europe's farmer protests, or this video on why Europe fell behind the United States economically.